Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the next in our endless series of everything to do with conductors, lists and lists of conductors. We now have something like, 100 of the top 20. So we're really making progress in putting together our top 20. Yeah, right, whatever. It just goes to show how silly these list things really are, but they're fun. And sometimes they're helpful, right? I mean, come on. We enjoy them, and it gives us a way of thinking about it and recognizing the artistry of people who we might have forgotten. I don't know. There's all kinds of things we can do aside from just like ranking them as like the best and the whatever. I mean, I've been trying throughout, as you've noticed, to categorize these things in ways that are helpful. That will guide your listening based on your own preferences. And here, I think, is a particularly interesting batch. This is 16 composers/conductors, great and not so great. So these are all composers who conducted or conductors who composed, seriously composed. Most conductors were composers. At one point in their lives, they gave it up. They became conductors. Something happened. But, Sell was a composer. Paul Kletsky was a composer. Otto Klemper was a composer. They all wrote music, and some of it got performed and recorded. But I'm talking about conductors/composers or composers/conductors who were serious at both endeavors and who had at least a fairly reasonable discography of their own music. And how good were they at conducting their own music? And how good were they as composers? So here's the way this works. We have the list. It's composer/conductor. And after each, I have listed them as great and not so great. In other words, whether or not so great and great, whether they were great or not so great as a composer, and then / great or not so great as a conductor, especially of their own works. So let's get started, shall we? I mean, the obvious place to begin, or one of them, is Benjamin Britten, who actually was a fine performing artist as a pianist also, and as a conductor. He was terrific. He's a great composer. I don't think we have to do the great, not so great for composer. But he was also great as a conductor, both of his own works and a lot of other people's as well. We have Britten the performer. We have him doing Mozart and Bach and The Dream of Gerontius and Mahler 4 and a terrible Francesca da Rimini. I mean, he wasn't great at everything, but no conductor is great at everything, right? Everybody has their on and off again stuff. But he was a very, very fine performer generally. So Britten is a great. No question about it. Copland. Copland is a great, not so great, because he was a great composer, unquestionably. He recorded a lot of his own music. He did make a couple great recordings of his own music. Specifically, there are two. There's the RCA Boston Symphony Appalachian Spring and Suite from the Tenderland. That is a beautiful disc. A beautiful, beautiful disc. And then there's his chamber version with the Columbia Chamber Players. I don't know, it was a walk-on group of Appalachian Spring in its original chamber version. That's a beautiful performance. And his first recording for Everest of his Third Symphony with statements, that wasn't bad. I mean, the sound is a little iffy and it's a little screechy, but, that gets an honorable mention. Everything else that he did, others did better. It wasn't that he was terrible, but he was not so great. And others did those works really more effectively, and that's okay. That's the way it goes sometimes. Life works that way. Elgar. Elgar's interesting because he's the first major composer, great, who recorded his music extensively. That was important in the history of the gramophone, in the history of recorded sound, but he was also a great conductor of his own stuff. He really was. He did it. He was, as so many composers are, he tended to be rather cool and unsentimental and detail, more interested in cleanness of detail. And to the extent we could tell, because some of these recordings are really rather grotty. He started in the acoustic universe and then graduated to electrical recordings. But it's a very powerful legacy, and his own performances are useful as guides to how it should sound. So that's important. His violin concerto with Yehudi Menuhin is still famous, as a reference recording for that piece. So good for him. Then we've got Igor Markevitch. Well, he was obviously a great conductor. As a composer, I would put him in the great category because he was an avant-garde composer who gave up composition, but he still created a considerable body of work, which has since been set down for Marco Polo, his complete works on like 8 CDs. I think Christopher Linden Guy is the conductor. And they prove that he was a genius as a composer. I mean, Ikar, in both its versions, is a masterpiece. And a bunch of other things that he did are really first-class works. So I think he belongs in the great category, even though his reputation was made as a conductor, and he only conducted one early recording of Ikar. He did not play his own music, which is very, very interesting. Another one who was sort of in a similar position was Jean Martinon, who was also a very, very serious composer, but he was a not so great. Hate to say it. It's not that his music's bad. It's that what we have of it has not impelled us to explore it further. And he was a great conductor, but as a composer, he's a not so great. You can't get around it. That's the judgment of history. You may want to override the judgment of history, which is, of course, your privilege, if you feel so inclined, but I wouldn't. I think it's probably pretty fair. Maybe someday the world will wake up and we'll start listening to his music regularly. But until that happens, he's a not so great. And Leif Segerstam, well, he was a great conductor. He was a wonderful conductor. He was full of personality and curiosity and strangeness at times. And as a composer, he wrote, 372 symphonies or something like that, most of which are based on, orchestras sitting out there doing random things, whatever they want, based on certain instructions that he would give them. And, he wrote other things too. But, who are we kidding? Not so great. I mean, it just sounds like shapeless, tuneless. I mean, I've heard quite a bit of it, and he had a chance to record enough of it to let us know that we are not missing much. I'm sorry, Mr. Segerstam, who I love dearly and was a terrific guy and oodles of fun. Morton Gould. Here's an interesting one. He's a great. I mean, his compositions are not as well known as they ought to be, but they're good. He was a very good composer. His 3 symphonies are terrific. The third is a major American symphony. He wrote all of those other suites and tone poem-y things, often on American subjects, Foster Gallery and the spirituals for strings, and really, really fine works. He was promoted heavily by Dmitri Mitropoulos, but by virtually nobody else. And there was a lot of jealousy. I mean, if you read Bernstein's letters, and his letters to Aaron Copland, they're always making fun of Morton Gould because Morton Gould had his own orchestra and he did Pop's recordings, jungle drums and things like that. And they were wonderful. But his legacy with the Chicago Symphony as a conductor is first class. He did that excellent Nielsen second and Ives and all kinds of other things. He had a wonderful ability as a conductor, and those popular music recordings are not to be sneered at, nor is the Latin American Sinfonette, which is one of the all-time masterpieces of light music. And, a masterpiece is a masterpiece. Doesn't matter what it's a masterpiece about. It was great stuff. He deserves far more respect than he gets. He really does. And his pop music stuff deserves a box. There's a lot of it, and it is so much fun. It's delicious. Absolutely delicious. So Morton Gould is one of those characters you need to pay attention to. Hindemith. Well, Hindemith, oh boy. Hindemith was not even a good conductor of his own music. He was terribly foursquare. And it's interesting because he was a violist of great distinction. He played in the Amar Quartet. It was a famous group. And nobody singled him out and said, oh, God, the violist, he's terrible. But as a conductor, he was so stiff and unyielding, although he did do a good Bruckner Seventh. That was released, and it was surprisingly effective. It really was. But generally speaking, even in his own music, other people did it better. Great composer. He's a great, not so great, without question. André Previn, who has so far escaped these lists for some reason or other, God knows why. But André Previn was unquestionably a great conductor. The Previn LSO box was amazing. It was a fabulous period in the history of the orchestra. He was beloved in the UK. He did some great recordings in Los Angeles for Telarc later in his career. And also he did some splendid things for Deutsche Grammophon. But as a composer, he wrote this big shapeless pudding of a violin concerto for Anna Sophie Mutter. He wrote A Streetcar Named Desire. He was a terrific jazz player, cool jazz of a particular type. And his film score to Elmer Gantry is marvelous. He should have done more. I've mentioned this before, but when I spoke to him once, I asked him why he didn't do more film composers. And he said, well, because film music work militates against the elongated thought. Well, that was his problem. His elongated thoughts were kind of shapeless and elongated, unfortunately. But and he did write some good music, but he was not a great composer. I mean, who are we kidding? So, great conductor, not so great composer. José Serebrier. He's a great. And again, he's not somebody that people largely think of, and undeservedly, because he wrote some wonderful music, some first-class pieces, which he's recorded on reference recordings and on Naxos. They're very, very good, and they're colorful, and he has a style all his own, and he's really a very, very brilliant musician. And his recordings are almost all good too. All that stuff he did for Naxos, his Glazunov cycle, the Dvorak symphonies. Well, they have their moments, but some of them are very good. And his earlier recordings for RCA, his Ives Fourth, which was tremendous. He's a really first-class musician who has, for some reason, managed to slide along under the radar of a lot of music lovers and people and whatnot. But basically, I mean, by and large, he was good at everything that he did. And that, whatever that symphony thing is called, Partido, whatever it was, is really wonderful. He was young and full of life, and he still writes music. He's a good all-around musician. Stravinsky. Oh, we have to do Stravinsky. Okay. Great, not so great. I mean, he was a great composer. I don't need to even say anything there. But his conducting of his own music was just not so great. Okay, he did a couple good things. The best recording he made of his own stuff is that disc of the symphonies, the symphonies in C, symphony in three movements. Those are very good. But he was totally at the mercy of the quality of the orchestras he got. And, people say, well, it's useful because, you get correct tempi. Well, who cares? We all know what the tempi are supposed to be, and there's more flexibility in that music than Stravinsky would probably allow. And so he was just not a great conductor at anything. He really wasn't. Bernard Herrmann, he was a great, not so great. He may have been great at one point, when he was running the radio orchestras for CBS. But later on, he was just slow and soggy. He was a chord guy. I mean, just an amazing chord guy. And he did some amazing things with chords. But his personality was so prickly, and he was so difficult. And it was so hard to get along with him. And, orchestras, sometimes they liked him. Most of the time, they hated him. Most of the time, his tempi were crazy slow. But, he was a great composer. There's no question about that. None whatsoever. So, Herrmann is a great, not so great. George Lloyd, he's a great. Of course, he mostly conducted his own music, but he was terrific at conducting his own music. And we know because we have other people doing his music. We have Edward Downes conducting the symphonies. Then we have George Lloyd doing it himself. And he's every bit as good. And he was a great composer. I mean, he wrote fabulous music. And so he was sort of the complete package as a composer-conductor, at least of his own works, without doubt. And fortunately, we have the recordings that prove it. Nobody has ever suggested that his recordings of his own pieces, even with the Albany Symphony, which is supposed to be a provincial orchestra, but which was really quite good, a very fine orchestra, but they sound as good as anybody, and he really galvanizes them to superior first-class work in his own music. So Lloyd gets that. Pierre Boulez, maybe controversial, not so great. Okay, he was a great conductor. We know that. He did amazing things within his Fach, and occasionally when he stepped out of it. Particularly his Ravel and Debussy was just phenomenal. His Second Viennese School, his Schoenberg and Webern and those people. I mean, his Berg Lulu, just wonderful, wonderful recordings of music that other people were not doing as well as he was. And he deserves tremendous credit for that. Now, as a composer, he was very important as an avant-gardist in his day, but no one gives a damn about him now. That's the reality. History has judged, and they have judged Boulez to be wanting as a composer. Now, sometimes it gets played. There are always people who, he'll have his little tiny, minuscule, midget-sized group of aficionados who will insist on his shattering greatness, and they can insist all they damn well please. The fact is that, it matters. What the public wants matters. How, these things get performed and how frequently and with what kind of attention they garner, all of that matters. And as a composer, it doesn't matter. That's just life. Maybe I'll be wrong. History continues to judge. Maybe something else will happen. But the reality is that at the moment, that's where we are with Pierre Boulez. Esa-Pekka Salonen. I'd call him a great. A great, not so much because, everyone is clamoring for the next great work by Esa-Pekka Salonen. He's unquestionably a great conductor. As a composer, what I've heard, and this, you may call me hypocritical because, Boulez, I could have said the same thing, right? People hear it, and some people say it's great, and some people say it's not. It doesn't get a lot of attention paid to it. Well, Salonen doesn't get a ton of attention paid to his music either. You don't see lots of other people conducting it, but it strikes me as really powerful, interesting stuff that has the potential, the potential at least, to find a niche in the universe of orchestral performance. It would be exciting if that happened. I could be totally wrong, but I would still rank him as a great, because whenever I've heard one of his compositions, I've been impressed. Me, personally. That's subjective. And of course, usually I'm not subjective at all. I'm completely and totally cold and clinical and objective and 100% accurate and truthful, as you know. But in this particular case, I think a little bit of subjectivity is warranted, and I want to give him the benefit of the doubt because he does really fine work, excellent work, and he is an amazing conductor. So there you go. And finally, last but not least, we return to where we started. The American equivalent of Benjamin Britten, even more so, Leonard Bernstein, who was a genius at everything he did. He was a great composer. He was a great conductor. He did everything well. He did everything 100%. He didn't have enough time. He needed extra lives. He really did. And it was amazing. So Bernstein is a great. We end on an up note. So there you are, friends. If you have other composers/conductors, and stick to the criteria I have here, that is, they are serious at both things and doing active work in both fields, not just somebody who happened to toss off something. I'm not talking about like Charles Mackerras, who wrote Pineapple Paul, and he's a composer. No, he wasn't a composer. He was a conductor who also composed a little on the side. But it's not the same thing as this group of people that we're talking about. So let's see what pops out. I'm curious. I hope you are too. Keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.